You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Robert Jackson, Executive Director of the Great Hearts Institute, and I am pleased to welcome you to the first or inaugural edition of the Virtue Podcast. We're going to be offering some opportunities for good conversation among some of our colleagues in classical education. From across this country, we'll be talking to leaders and trainers. We'll be talking to professors and scholars, folks who are interested in the rising movement and the renaissance that we discover in classical education. My first guest is going to be Andrew J. Zwerneman, president of the Cana Academy. With nearly 4 decades of experience as a master teacher and as a school leader, Andrew has taken his experiences and traveled across this country to provide education, to provide training, and to equip the next generation of teachers in the classical movement. Andrew, it's so good to have you with me this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I'm just so delighted and honored to be part of this wonderful podcast, and particularly honored that I get a chance to join you for the very first one. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you being here, and it seems fitting. Surely you have been such an active part of the work here at Great Hearts from its inception, and it's good to have you with us today to talk about your latest publication. Now, Cana is pretty productive. We've seen over the years that your work is really coming forth as a form and as an opportunity to give shape to classical ed, as I said. Tell us a little bit about Cana Academy and what you're trying to accomplish with that organization.
Yeah, Cana Academy is an academy for teachers. 6 years ago, 2 of my colleagues and I retired from schools proper, and we decided to pass on our 100 plus years of experience in the most cost-effective way to as many teachers as we could to effect the best learning experience for as many students as we can possibly effect. And in order to do that, we established Cana Academy. We've loaded an enormous amount of material up on our website. To date, we have over 50 guides on classic works of literature. These are guides by which teachers can lead great discussions, learn themselves about the classic works that occupy the heart of our classical tradition. We have all sorts of teaching materials that are available for free. We run master courses, especially during the summer when teachers are off. And we have over 200 blog posts and podcasts intended to help seminar leaders, teachers of writing, teachers of history, teachers of the humanities. We're so grateful to have a role to play in this beautiful movement, which is a great source of culture and a great source of hope for Americans.
Well, I've read a couple of your books and, of course, been witness to your training, which has been so well received in our network at Great Hearts. But from what I'm hearing, it's something that you're doing across the country in schools from coast to coast. So it's really a pleasure to see this work supported by your team. But I'm really interested in this latest publication that you've put forward entitled The Life We Have Together, subtitled A Case for Humane Studies, A Vision for Renewal. Andrew, given the various subjects that you're familiar with and that you're training teachers to bring to the classroom, why did you choose to write this book at this time?
Well, I chose it because the times in which we live are marked by a loss of love for the life that we have together. And society is intrinsically good. It's the place in which we're situated. All good advancements in human culture, justice, family life, education, political order, peace, technological advancements that serve the good of human beings. All these things happen within society. And at the same time, there is a very terrible and toxic loss of love in America for the life that we have. And my hope in penning this little book was to restore some vision. We are both inherently creatures of love. We're also inherently creatures of observation. So the book is intended to stir up some vision about who we are and how we ought to live, which vision is born from the Western tradition. And my hope is that by revisiting some of the great works and the great ways of thinking and the great ways of loving and the great ways of knowing. We could help teachers especially find a way to regain vision and to stir among themselves and among their students especially a renewed love for society, for our culture, for the West, for the general tradition that we're all keepers of.
You state that Americans have lost this love, right, of the life that we share together, or at least it's in decline. But I'm very interested in what you think are maybe some of the causes behind that loss. This is a very powerful proposition that you're articulating. Can you identify for us some of the reasons that you think we've lost our love of this life together?
Yeah, I didn't articulate that in the book. I assumed that everyone would recognize the loss. The analysis of the loss is singularly one of the greatest or largest and most complicated exercises that scholars and commentators, leaders of all kinds are engaged in. And I guess I would land my chief point of reference at the feet of the ideological left. I know that some people would say that the problems that ail us in America have largely to do with our liberal tradition. John Locke, they put their finger on John Locke and they run almost a straight line to where we are today. I don't really think that is that may be reading Locke and how to understand the liberal tradition is certainly part of the puzzle. But I think the chief problem is something that's post World War II. And that is we had a number of ideological sons and daughters of Marx come across the Atlantic from Europe. And we started to see a number of decades of influencing our academies, or especially our humanities departments. I think just to point out two really articulate analyses of what I'm talking about, actually, if you go back to Alan Bloom in Closing of the American Mind in the 1980s, he warned us about this. He said that critical theory and the practitioners of critical theory came over after the war, were taking over our humanities departments. 2 decades later or so, Victor Davis Hanson and his cohorts, Thornton and Veith, they, in their book called The Bonfire of the Humanities, they detail in very clear arguments how the ideological left has just toxically permeated the humanities departments. Another really good analysis of that was the late Roger Scruton's book, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands. And he drills down to the philosophies of Sartre, Adorno, Foucault and crowd, and Marcuse, who have upended the cart in Europe and in America. I think that's the chief problem. In our circle, working with secondary and primary students, we see a terrible residue of the intellectual left in the writings of Howard Zinn, the 1619 Project, critical race theory, all of which are more or less residual evidence of Karl Marx's continued influence on the culture and its resurgence of late. I think that's chiefly, in a woke culture, a diminished humanities culture, where students are less and less taking the humanities seriously, and they disparage the humanities, and in that light, they disparage the West, they disparage America, they disparage Christianity, philosophy, even art. And in that spirit, I think is a great loss. It's a great loss of memory. It's a great loss of vision and a great loss of commitment to who we are.
And it does seem, to your point, that there's kind of casual cynicism, right, that pervades the next generation, the iGen, as they're sometimes referred to, that they can be so dismissive of things higher and long-standing, right, that are part of our tradition. But you specifically dig in your book. You mentioned Howard Zinn's reading of history and his approach, his method, if you will. What are some of those misunderstandings that folks like Zinn seem to be propagating in the study of history?
Well, the study of history is the study of a society moving in time and changing. Change is a given, it's not an end. With Howard Zinn, He overtly says several times in his work that he doesn't believe in the idea of a nation or a society. He doesn't believe in the United States as a community. He only focuses as an historian on something like the chronicle of egregious oppression. And then he collects what he sees, not in and much of it is exaggerated. He reduces things to historically to less than what they are, and by dividing us from our past, he then in turn divides us from each other, because he redefines us not as human beings who have a life together, but rather as the oppressed and the oppressors. And he defines us according to class, race, and gender, none of which can capture what it means to be a human person. All of them are deficient conceptualizations of what it means to be a human being. So that he neglects what history is as a field of study, that he neglects our inherent community, that is, we're a community of the dead, the living, and the yet to be born, and that he divides us are all terrible, terrible influences on the study of history. He also abides by the Marxian principle that there's no intrinsic good. And of course, the number one intrinsic good that he dismisses is society. The only potential intrinsic good is the future society that will come about beyond revolution. That's a classic total critique right out of the intellectual left. And that's everywhere. That disheartens people. People say, oh, yeah, well, America's no good. The Constitution's no good. Martin Luther King couldn't have been speaking the truth when he invoked the founding and the I Have a Dream speech. He couldn't have been speaking the truth when he invoked philosophy, medieval theology, and natural law theory, when he invoked the American founding from the Birmingham jail. None of this can possibly be true if Howard Zinn is right, but he's not right. And in fact, he's not right as an historian using the tools of the field of historiography, nor is he right in his ontology, his anthropology, or his moral understanding. These are all terrible influences. And one of the best things we can do when the ideological left tells us, and I'm not talking about politics here, I'm talking about historians, philosophers, political scientists, and so forth, when they tell us to forget the past, the best thing we can do in following the footsteps of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other great historical minds is to remember the past. That's the best thing we can do. So one of the things I do right out front in the first 3 chapters is to tackle history and to encourage everybody to remember as we've been taught to remember by the likes of Solzhenitsyn, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and our great liberal-minded historians, men like Wilfred McClay, Bernard Bailyn, James McPherson, Gordon Wood, and others who, without political agenda, have taught us all to think observationally and sympathetically about the past, to look at all the details of an historical event without reducing it to anything less than what it is, and to look sympathetically at the human condition. We're not perfect. Human beings are never perfect, or therefore societies are never perfect, but you don't have to be perfect to be good. And the intrinsic goodness of each human life and human society are what we need to attend to again. And again, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to try to awaken among my fellow teachers and our students a sensibility about that intrinsic goodness. That's where it all begins. And that goodness was underscored in Greek philosophy and in Christian revelation and medieval philosophy and the great Western tradition. We start from goodness and we proceed from that. You can't proceed otherwise.
As you're describing this ideological and revolutionary approach, it strikes me that there's something ironic about their vision for the future of some better or perfected moment, when their reading of our past is simply one damn thing after another. It's all really in error. It's corrupt. It's not good. How is it that they come to this conclusion that after the revolution, it will in fact be good again? Not again, be good for the first time, right?
Well, following in the footsteps of Marx, number one, they reject philosophy as a mode of understanding. Philosophy in Marx's hand, and he's quite overt about this, is not a matter of understanding reality. It's a matter of changing the world, changing reality. And what he means by change is violent revolution. And secondly, what Marx rejected was this, and that's rejecting the first normative source of authority in Western history, that is philosophy, the love of wisdom, which gave us what? The university. It gave us the sciences and the arts. It gave us tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of academies at all level, institutes, libraries, think tanks, institutions like the Great Hearts Institute and Virtue Journal. All these things were have their intellectual and political roots in the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. The second great source of normative authority in Western tradition is revelation, out of which we get the love of God, the love of neighbor, the habits of mind that have to do with charity, liberality, solidarity, and above all, an emphasis on the dignity of each life that is intrinsically good. It's a life around which, in fact, we order our politics. That's the heart of liberal politics, is that the individual is a reminder of our origins. That is, our origins from within ourselves and from beyond ourselves. If you reject philosophy, if you reject religion, you've rejected the heart of culture. You've rejected the heart of our past. And that's exactly what Marx did. That's exactly what his descendants have done, what Zen does. Zen doesn't care anything about those things. He cares about changing the world. That's why change is the purpose. It's not a given. That's why he treats history as a chronicle of oppression rather than the story, the narrative of a society which is a whole, a society which is a community of the dead, the living, and the yet to be born, and a society that's intrinsically good.
There is much to explore here in your book. I'd like to transition a bit here to the second section, which moves from that memory focus around history and recollecting that which is good to the work of imaginative literature that is replete in our tradition. You spend a good bit of time around that, and you articulate a number of misunderstandings, you believe, that have been sort of placed upon or maybe used as a gloss in the reading of imaginative literature. Where does lit fit in the work of forming young souls?
Yes, so imaginative literature, which would, by which I mean lyric poetry, epic poetry, drama, short stories, and novels, offer all of us experiences by which our vision of our humanity grows, our feeling for one another deepens. Sorry, by feeling I mean sympathy, love. Sympathy means two things, really. It means to suffer with those who suffer. And of course, a lot of imaginative literature moves us that way. You think of Achilles and Priam mourning together in Achilles' tent in book 24 of the Iliad, or you think about the way Dante moves through the three spheres of the afterlife as a way of confronting his own suffering and about encountering the range of human suffering. You think about John Donne, the old man going blind and facing down death, and in his incarnational, resurrectional imagination, he has something to say about death, and this speaks to all of our experience about because we all die, right? We all face that. All of these expressions are so important to understand what it means to be a human person. They don't wax philosophical, and yet they illuminate the human condition. They don't speak in abstract concepts, and yet we end up understanding something about what it means to be a person. And what it means to be a person is to live our lives for one another. So what it means to be a person is to give our lives generously, even sacrificially. That's what it means to be a person. So while we don't look for takeaway morals, we don't look for imaginative literature as case studies in ethics, we do realize that great imaginative works situate us in the world, just like great painting and great film and great music and great dance. They situate us in the world in the sense that they allow us to see what we couldn't see, except that they saw it, they captured it, and they relayed it to us in the compact form of a poem, or the great form of an epic poem, or the magnificence of a novel, or the compact form of a short story. And in working through how we think about imaginative literature and what that means for our vision, I take my cue from two of our greatest female writers, Helen Vendler, who's a professor emeritus at Harvard and a longstanding and arguably our greatest poetry critic and scholar of poetry in America. And then the late Flannery O'Connor, who was a great story writer, novelist herself, but also was a great essayist. The two of them agree that the best way to approach an imaginative work is from the inside. Flannery O'Connor says the meaning of a story lies in the details packed into the story by the author. Helen Vendler says a close reader of poetry stands inside a poem the way one stands inside a work of architecture, and you see how one part articulates with the others. So I'm very keen that the experience that is afforded us as readers and that our students are free to engage is an experience that's accessible, not by way of abstraction, not by way of, say, philosophy or more noetic modes of thought, but by imagination internal to the works that the authors and the poets give us.
Fascinating that history is constitutes the recollection of our experience, of our human and humanity. But imaginative literature provides us that internalization that you're describing, that the great poets and the great authors produce, where we can experience something vicariously by following them right into these worlds, these imaginative worlds. Is there a relationship, as you see it, between history and, of course, the recollection that you've described so carefully, and the imaginative literature that, as you see it, for this formative experience for the young?
I would say it this way, that it's not just history and imaginative literature, but the scriptures, philosophy, the sciences. And what do I mean by that? Culture is the collection of what we know and love. And there's no limiting knowledge to any one sphere within the humanities. And there's no limiting love. Love is ultimately, each love is related to universal love, right? And I practice that by loving my wife and children, my students, my colleagues, each person I serve. And it's an incoherent thing if we try to love a few, but we don't love others, like we hate them or we treat them with disregard or something like that. All the humanities especially point to this reality, that at the core of reality is love. At the core of what it means to be a person is love. And history is a habit of mind that, among other things, stirs in us a love for the past, a love for the community to which we are bound. That is, the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. If we forget the past, we forget those to which we're bound. And if we forget those, we forget ourselves. We all begin to know ourselves by observing other people. We see this seminally in the experience of a baby who is resting in his mother's arms or his father's arms, his siblings, and he looks up in their faces and he sees them and he doesn't know what to think. There are hardly any thoughts in a baby's mind, but the baby experiences love. And as the baby grows, the baby assimilates the language, the words that at first become, start as babbling and then become articulations of who he is as a member of the family and so forth. But observation is the foundation there. It's the same in history. We learn about ourselves by observing others in the past, our ancestors, our predecessors. And among other things, we learn that great writers of imaginative literature have given us a tremendous gift. They have experienced something in life, have captured it, and then they pass it on to us. And we wouldn't see what they see except that they passed it on to us. So the habit of recollection is, yes, symbiotically related to the habit of imagination, but it's also related to the habit of the love of wisdom and to the love of God and neighbor. That, Augustine says our memory is where we collect everything that we know and love. It's right dead center to who we are as persons. So I think you're onto something. I think it's a very interesting question you ask, and I hope that I gave it at least a decent answer. It warrants a lot of consideration.
No, you did. And it takes me to the place where I'd like to just recap for our audience that your book is touching on 5 areas that you have brought to the table, 5 areas that you believe constitute a good portion of a liberal education: history, as we've talked about, imaginative literature. we've of course discussed philosophy, at least obliquely, but you also mentioned visual arts
Yeah.
as well as the scripture. So perhaps you could spend just a little bit of time explaining to us this integration. And I don't want to short shrift visual arts, given that we live in a time and in a moment where the visual medium is so prominent.
Right. So you want to know how the visual arts relate to the project, or?
I do, and of course how these five come together, how you're seeing them in the full formation of human beings.
Right. So they're all five of them: history, imaginative literature, philosophy, the visual arts, and scripture. I maintain are ways of seeing. And seeing is, well, first of all, sight's an intrinsic good, right? So just
Mhm.
seeing is something we all value. And you don't have to say, well, why would you want to see, right? Like, why would you want health? Why would you want love? Why would you want peace in life? Uh, they're all modes of seeing. The visual arts are the most sensual in that we are actually seeing in material arrangement um, the works of beauty that the artists present to us. And you hear that phrase, art for art's sake. Well, I
Mm,
think that makes sense if you realize that seeing is an intrinsic good. It's an intrinsically ennobling experience to see something beautiful. An artist, say in film or a painting or a sculpture, uh, draws us into the experience that he's had or he's captured by way of the material arrangement. And he redeems something in life by allowing us to see what he sees. And that is to say, Scruton said, Roger Scruton says this rather outrageous thing. He says, life's kind of boring except for art. And what he means by that is the artists see the world in ways that almost nobody else sees, and then relay it again to us or relate it to us. Their work is inherently relational. That is to
mhm.
say, their work mediates between themselves and their viewers. Their work mediate between us, the viewers, and the world itself. The art situates us in the world. It makes life livable, and it does it because we see more. So it's kind of a kissing cousin to the experience of the poor chap who's down there in Plato's cave, who's dragged up mysteriously by the person we never meet. And he's
Mhm.
brought, instead of seeing only shadows on the wall, which is really nothing at all, he comes up and he sees reality, a tree for what it is. He sees himself for who he is. He sees the sun, gets acclimated to light. That's kind of what's going on in a rekindling of vision, is that we are renewing our sensibilities, our intellectual, moral, spiritual, and sensual sensibilities, because we are learning how to see again. And that's what the book is devoted to. And I think that's the purpose of the humanities, which in turn are the heart of a liberal or a classical education.
To see again, I like it. To see afresh, to see with the artists in our tradition, and to be renewed. You quote Roger Scruton towards the tail end of your book, who says that Western culture is the knowledge of the human heart.
Mhm.
Perhaps you want to elaborate on that just a little bit as we wind down here. How is it that Western culture is this knowledge of the human heart, and how does that relate to a classical liberal arts education?
Well, I come back to a comment I made early on in the podcast, and that is the great normative sources of authority in our tradition. And by normative, I mean the sources that allow us to say who we are intelligently uh, and with clarity, and the sources that allow us to answer the question, how ought we live? And those sources are love oriented, love driven, love founded, love directed. The love of philosophy, the love of God and neighbor, but also the love of art, the love of freedom. Uh, you know, uh, the Western political tradition at its best is a tradition that adheres to genuine human freedom and allows the individual person to find himself or herself as a free person, not just free from constraints, but free in turn, intellectually, spiritually, morally, and free in turn to give himself or herself to others. That's the heart of the matter. The humanities illuminate our encounters with one another. They deepen our knowledge of one another because fundamentally we are bound to each other heart to heart. That is our most foundational connection to other human beings and to the world around us is an affective or a love-directed foundation. Eric Voegelin called reality a community of being, a quaternarian community, right? A four-part or a four-member. And who are the members? Man or human beings, God, society, and the world around us. But it's a community, and communities are bound by love. Aristotle says the more we rely on love, the less we rely on law. The more we rely on law, the less our lives are marked by love. I think increasingly we're looking around and we're seeing a terrible heightening of law, of public force, of a reliance upon institutions not of the heart, but institutions of power. And I'm not saying something I'm not making a total critique of political order or government or something like that. No. To the contrary, I'm trying to illuminate how our understanding of politics in light of what's most important or what's most central to who we are, and that is love. And our tradition illuminates that by way of philosophy, the revelation, art, liberal politics, and perhaps above all, personalism. That is, from the very beginning of our culture, there was an emphasis on the person. We see this in Greek drama. The actor didn't reveal his face to the audience. He wore a mask, which word in Greek is the persona. In other words, the person mediates between the audience and the actor, so the catharsis happens. We see this in the Christ Pantocrator, arguably the greatest icon in Western history, where the image of Christ reflects the patristic division or articulation of two natures, one person. The divine nature is representing kind of a smooth, unmarred, open-eyed half of his face. The human part, the human nature is portrayed in a slightly marred or closed, slightly closed eye. But the thing is, you can't approach the divinity of Christ in that icon except through human imagery, right? You have in the abolition movement, the Brits could not overwhelm slavery until Wedgwood devised that beautiful medallion where you have a black African slave in chains on his knee, and he's surrounded by two questions. And the first question, am I not a man? And the second question, am I not your brother? And in other words, the personhood of it's not his slavery, but his personhood that mediates between slavery and the rest of us, which impels us to change. A final example is the beautiful image of the white crucifixion painted by Marc Chagall, just weeks after Kristallnacht in Nazi Germany, where the Jews were openly assaulted. It's the night of broken glass, right? Their synagogues, houses, homes, and businesses were attacked. Weeks after that, he painted the white crucifixion, and it's a Jewish depiction of Jesus. And they had the suffering Jesus at the center of a ring of suffering Jews in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Jews in diaspora. What's the meaning of that? The meaning of that painting is that the person, the suffering person, the ancient suffering Jew is in solidarity with the modern suffering Jew. And the question that's posed to us is, who's going to climb the ladder and bring the suffering Jew down from the cross? And it's true, as Yaroslav Pelikan says, that Jesus belonged to the Hebrew people. And we see this definitely the Jesus of that white crucifixion painting belongs to the Hebrew people. But because he belongs to the Hebrew people, he belongs to the Christian church, and he belongs to the whole world, right? Why? Because in the person, you have both the scriptures and the icon and the painter Marc Chagall have captured the whole of being represented in the person. And that's the heart of Western culture. And we get that, then we hit pay dirt. And that's why I wrote the book, to see if people can stir again their vision of what it means to be a human, which in turn will stir our love for one another and for the life that we have in society.
It is, in fact, a beautiful text, and this is just a taste of what you have collected for us in the pages of the life we have together. You've given us plenty of food for thought. I think we're going to have some show notes with the various texts that you've referenced and scholars of note. So I'll follow up with you, Andrew, and we'll post that for our viewers later. I'm also pleased to mention that you're going to be joining us next February for the National Symposium for Classical Education, where I assume you're going to bring copies of this text and others from Cana Academy.
Well, I will now.
And for our viewers, if interested, you can go to canaacademy.org and find this text along with several others that Andrew has penned. We are so delighted, Andrew, with this conversation. It's a great way to kick this podcast off. Thank you for your time with us, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you, and thank you, Rob, and the whole team at Great Hearts for the wonderfully rich and terribly important work you're doing. You all are keepers of our culture at the most important level, just pumping life into our students and creating the best public schools in America. Keep it up.
Thank you, Andrew. And coming up next Tuesday, we will be interviewing Mark Bauerlein of First Things. He'll be talking to us about memory, but in a slightly different key and in concert with the work that we've just heard from Andrew. So join us next Tuesday to hear from Mark Bauerlein. Thanks for joining us at the Virtue Podcast. Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.